Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if there are techniques for building empathy for people who have narcissistic personality disorder. So these would be techniques used by a counselor when treating somebody with NPD. Now, the impact of an individual with NPD on a mental health agency really depends on the type of agency that we're looking at. I've consulted to many agencies that just were not equipped to counseling people with NPD, and other agencies that did really well with it. If the counselors in an agency are really unprepared for dealing with cluster B personality pathology and specifically NPD, it can be really disturbing and troubling to their kind of routine when somebody with NPD seeks treatment. The analogy I like to use is if somebody works at the Division of Motor Vehicle. They're used to dealing with a lot of different problems. Somebody comes in and they want their vehicle titled, they want to register a vehicle, they're renewing a license, or maybe they have some sort of odd question like they want to get a title for a kit car, like a car they built themselves. But then imagine that Godzilla shows up to DMV, right? There's no frame of reference for that. Right, he doesn't even fit in the building. You can only really see his feet. He's got the flames coming from his mouth. He's burning everything, knocking things over. So the workers there couldn't even get a context. They wouldn't even know where to start with trying to help Godzilla with his automotive registration needs or whatever he's looking for. I don't know what Godzilla would want at a DMV. Maybe a vanity tag? Either way, that's kind of the analogy for it, right? It's that unusual compared to the other types of pathology that counselors often deal with. When I consult to agencies, they'll describe NPD cases as disorienting, right? They don't think there's a treatment protocol. They don't know what to do. They worry that they won't be effective in their treatment of that individual, that they won't provide good care. And some will refer, which I think is a good idea if a counselor doesn't have a lot of experience with NPD. But sometimes there's really no option, right? It's not like there are mental health agencies everywhere that can meet everyone's needs. So sometimes counselors just have to treat the person in front of them and do their best. Go to the research literature, talk to supervisors, and kind of work it out. And a lot of times we'll see they'll deploy therapies like CBT or psychodynamic therapy, reality therapy, something like that, but they won't, again, know exactly what techniques to use to address narcissism. Narcissism can be very difficult to treat. And one of the most significant challenges is in developing empathy, right? So this is what I hear a lot. How can I develop empathy in people who are narcissistic? Whether it's a treatment-focused question or not, right? This could be just a question that people ask in their daily lives. They know a narcissist. What can they do to improve empathy in that person? Well, empathy is interesting because there are clear advantages to empathy, right? It's helpful in getting along in society. It can offer a new perspective. Sometimes people will look at something and they'll say, I never looked at it that way before. That's kind of an important moment for somebody, right? When you see something from another perspective, it's a special moment. Narcissists don't do that, right? I guess it's one of the perks of knowing everything, right? They don't have that different perspective. They feel like they already have everything under control in terms of knowledge. So narcissists are missing important opportunities to grow. Now, narcissists are typically high in cognitive empathy and low in affective empathy, right? So it's not a global empathy deficit that counselors or anyone else would be dealing with typically. So the cognitive empathy is there. They can understand how people feel, but they don't express that understanding. So they're bad at empathic responding. So they're not acting on the cognitive empathy. But again, since the cognitive empathy is present, is there a way to tap into that, to build affective empathy? Now, in a sense, narcissists only have a chance of showing affective empathy to one person, themselves. So what can we do with that information? We know that is usually what's going on. What can we do to use that to build a technique to help people develop empathy? Well, one thing we can do is explore a relationship with what we call the younger self, right? So if you're treating a client and they're 50 years old or 55 years old, and you're talking to them about themselves when they were 10 or 12, that 10 or 12-year-old is the younger self. Of course, it's still the same person, just a younger version of that same person. Now, one of the interesting parts about this technique around the younger self is that it both is and is not the client, depending on their point of view. They may love the younger self, they may hate the younger self, they may be somewhere in between, they may see their younger self as a victim, a perpetrator, a hero, a legend, a loser, a misunderstood genius, or a predator. This technique is about starting a conversation between the individual with NPD and the younger self. Obviously, it's not a real conversation. Again, it technically is the same person. It's a role play. It's an exploration of thoughts and feelings. It's also not the same as writing a note. I've seen this technique many times, and it's not necessarily a bad technique, but that's not what I'm talking about here. This is a conversation. This is also not exactly the same thing as the empty chair technique we see in Gestalt therapy, although the basic idea is quite similar. With narcissism, you would typically expect a lot of resistance with something as dramatic and structured as the empty chair technique. However, narcissists like to talk about themselves, and that's what you're really using here. You're capitalizing on the strength of narcissism and trying to develop empathy. Also, the empty chair technique is usually done to resolve a conflict or integrate the parts of a client's personality. So the client may be sitting in a chair, and then you set up an empty chair, and you say, in that empty chair, we see the angry part of you is sitting there, or the sad part of you, right? Or someone in their life who's significant, like mother, father, brother, romantic interest. So the aim here with this particular technique for building empathy is specifically on the younger self. You really can't substitute in a lot of different people. It has to be that younger version of the client. This technique is really focused. It's focused on, again, the developing of those empathy skills, but also underscoring the value of using them. It's very context specific, not just like talking to your younger self in that chair, but going toward the younger self and talking to them where they are. It kind of has a time travel feel to it, and of course Gestalt does not. So how is this technique structured? Well, often individuals who develop NPD had stressful childhoods. We see inconsistent discipline is fairly common. So if they come home late every night for several nights in a row and nothing happens, then one night they come home 5 minutes late and they're grounded for a month. That's inconsistent discipline. We see they get too much praise often, which would be notably absent when the person grows older, right? So the parents aren't there to praise them, and they've come to expect it. So now they become narcissistic to compensate for that, to compensate for the loss of that praise. That's one theory anyway. We also see a lot of bullying, and this builds things like resentment, hate, and distrust. And it's not unusual to see trauma and trauma over an extended period of time. For example, the individual was a victim of verbally abusive behavior that took place over the course of years. So with the idea of how we conceptualize what leads to narcissism, now we move kind of through the technique. And first we select an age and a place, right, for that younger version of the narcissist. So starting with the age, we look for an age when there were problems, but the problems weren't too severe yet. We don't want to pick a time when all the damage was already done. We're looking for a time when there was good and bad, hope and a cause for concern. A time before the younger self really understood themselves as being in trouble. So essentially a nostalgic time, but also a time of ambivalence, strong feelings in both directions. As the narcissist looks back at this particular age that's selected, in a sense they should smile at some of the memories as they think about it, but be troubled by others. They want to have this conversation with the younger self to capture the positive emotions, but also to warn the younger self of upcoming problems or to encourage them. There is no one age when this would be the case for everyone who is narcissistic. It's not like you can always go back to 8 years old or 12 years old. It's different for everybody. In terms of the place, what am I talking about here? Well, this is kind of like the context. Are they looking at the younger self at home or in school? What place are they looking at? You want to pick a place where the younger self was having feelings that could be observed and responded to by the individual with NPD. The younger self alone in a room, sad and isolated. The younger self in a heated argument with a sibling. Maybe they're being humiliated by classmates, right? So that's what I mean by the place. Now, after the age and place are established, the narcissist simply describes what they see. So they go back in time and observe the younger self without interacting. So what did they see? What were the daily activities? Who were they spending time with? What were the relationships like? How was school going during that time period? The counselor really takes on the role of the ghost of Christmas present from A Christmas Carol, right? Except the counselor needs the client to describe what's going on. So they're not really right beside the client, right? They can't see what the client sees. They're counting on the client to describe what the younger self looks like. And at this point, we're not necessarily getting into feelings. Now, the next step is to simply explore potential topics of conversation between the narcissist and the younger self without actually having the conversation yet. The counselor wants to make sure that the conversation will facilitate emotional expression. That's an important part here. So some of the topics I've seen: the narcissist encouraging the younger self, the transmission of a message, like the individual with NPD explains to the younger version of themselves that things will get better. They encourage them to just hang on, tells them to stand up to certain people, or to be confident. Now, sometimes we see pragmatic but therapeutically unhelpful content, like giving the younger self stock tips. You have to remind the client here that this isn't actually time travel, right? They're not actually going to change the future for the younger version of themselves. Now, it's at this point when feelings might be noticed, right? So the narcissist is feeling hopeless for the younger self, feeling mad because it's just a hypothetical conversation. They really wish they could go back and actually change things. They may be disgusted by the younger self. Then there's the actual conversation itself, which of course is facilitated through a variety of questions. What do you want to say to the younger self? What does the younger self want to say to you? Now, sometimes these questions are more effective if they're limited a bit. For example, what is the one thing you really want the younger self to know? Right? That kind of constricts the possible answers a bit. The counselor may also say something like, what do you think of the younger self? How would you describe their personality and their mood? So we're moving over a little bit into emotions and feelings. We could also look at the other way. What does the younger version think of you now? Would they be impressed with you and how you turned out, or would they be disappointed? After seeing you and talking to you, would your younger self be inspired and looking forward to the future, or dread growing into an adult? Now, using this technique, we can see that this can wander off pretty easily into a lot of different areas. But again, here the focus is empathy, trying to steer the narrative to the client's understanding of how the younger self feels, or the point of view of the younger self. Does the younger self understand how the client feels? So the beauty of this technique is really either one of these is actually developing empathy in the client. Now, after the client gets practice empathizing, the technique can then transition to another place therapeutically in a few different ways. One way is to ask the client to react to the observation of the younger self in a way that would be helpful to the younger version. This is to build that affective empathy that I was talking about before. So empathetic responding. Remember, the cognitive empathy is intact with narcissism usually. It's the expression of appropriate emotion that doesn't happen the way we would expect it to. Now, another way this technique could go is the counselor can move into helping the client use that same skill with other people. And it helps to start with people who display the same affect as the client's younger self. For example, a counselor might say, you mentioned your younger self would stare off into space and get deep into thought. Who else do you know who does that, right? So it might connect to somebody in the client's life. It might be a romantic partner, a friend, a coworker, somebody does the same thing. And now things kind of click. They understand, oh, they might have been feeling the same way that I was feeling, right? And that's really what you're hoping for, that moment where things kind of snap into place for the client. And I've seen this happen many times. Not all the time, of course, but when it does happen, it's something you can really build on. It feels like a definitive gain in the therapeutic process. So that's my summary of this technique. Working with narcissistic personality disorder can be challenging. This is just one technique that could be helpful in some situations if the goal is to improve empathy. I know whenever I talk about the treatment of narcissistic personality disorder, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found the description of this younger self technique to build empathy to be interesting. Thanks for watching.